So we left off looking at how the Dones were treated, right, through that. Um, those the new laws that came in, they had to prove their land, and then how the squatters came in with their mentality of, well, we just need to take land because it is our right to do so, right, from sea to shining sea. And now we're going to look at different aspects of what happens to Mexican Americans. But before I get into that, I want to address who actually are the biggest benefactors of opening the West. And there's a show called I think it's called Hell on Wheels, and it's a good show looking at the development of the railroads and the trains. Trying to they're in competition to build uh, the, the railroads from one end of the country to the other, and they're supposed to meet at a certain point, and whoever reaches there first wins. Well, there's a scene there where the guy that's kind of building the railroad says, we could just build a straight line from this point to that point and beat the other group, right? Because it's a competition. There's a prize at the end. And the actual owner of the railroad says, "What are you, stupid? The whole point is not to win. The whole point is to get as much land as possible because the federal government was actually giving railroad companies free land." So he was saying, instead of building in a straight line, let's kind of meander left and right and kind of go up all over the place, because we get a certain amount of land to the left and to the right of every railroad track that we lay. And this really kind of showcases this notion of when we speak of welfare, we typically think of poor people getting free money, and it's never the case. It's actually corporations who end up benefiting so much more than some poor, American who gets some check from the federal government or something like that. And we don't call that corporate welfare, right? Or we don't call it welfare, sorry. We call it entrepreneurship. But the reality, it's welfare. It's corporate welfare, but it's welfare nonetheless. And unfortunately, we don't see it that way. So when we look at the economy, and you kind of see this, I'm not sure if you see them in our readings, but one of the justifications to take the land away from Mexico and from the people who own the territory is because, from the American perspective, is that they're not using the land to its fullest potential. And if the Americans can take it over, then they would utilize it to its fullest potential. So what happens? Well, settling the West is a great example of corporate welfare because it's government who builds the West. It's not the rugged individual that we talked about earlier, right? Yeah, again, hookers, right, to build it too. But it's really government who steps in and builds that builds the West. And a great example are the railroads. So if you ever go to California and see places like Huntington Beach, uh, Huntington, what is it? The Huntington Library, which is in Pasadena, by Pasadena. It's a really kind of pretty town over there in California. Huntington Park, right? These places are named after these people who were basically just taking territory um, for their own profit. And yeah, they built the railroad tracks, but they were getting so much free money from the government, which is something we still see today, right? I'm sure with the tax breaks that we got, working class people did not benefit. However, corporations and really wealthy people, got a lot of money back. So it's kind of the reality of, unfortunately, the way government works, and it's no different back then. We see, what built the West. Another example. So it's not just the railroads, right, who benefit from it. Other companies benefit too. But the government. It's really the government coming in and creating the West. They built in the military, and by building a military base, it kind of attracts population. And I mean, Jesus, the West Valley here is a great example of that. If that Luke Air Force Base were to close, so much would, it would just kill our economy. And again, that's being supported by the federal government. I think Lockheed Martin is right, right by here too, right? Those of us that are, live in Litchfield Park and Goodyear. And you see how, again, the government sets up a base and it just attracts all these other industries. And the same thing happened in Los Angeles. Los Angeles was a small, sleepy town. They put up a military base there, and all of a sudden, boom, you have population growth. No longer somebody, searching for gold in some river up in the mountains, but developing some form of commerce in these places. So we see a place like LA grow. Another great example is the mining industry. Yeah, like I mentioned a second ago, right? You have these people who are panning for gold and, wearing funny hats and Levi pants and things like that. But those aren't really the people who strike you rich. There's corporations. I think it's like Dodge or Dodge Phelps. I can't remember. It was here in Arizona, the company. And these are big corporations, basically, right? That get these, that are just extracting a lot of minerals from these different, mountain ranges and so forth. So it's not just, a individual who's trying to strike it rich. It's really corporations who are benefiting from this and who are developing mining towns. And within this context, I mean, you have different groups who are actually really good miners, such as the Chinese, such as Peruvians and Chileans are some of the best miners, and even Mexicans, because there's a lot of mining in the northern parts of Mexico, and they actually restrict the migration of some of these people. The best example that we have is the Chinese Exclusion Act, and a lot of it's not just because of the gold rush, but because they see them as competition, and sometimes they are better than your American or Euro-American miner, so they block them out, right? I think foreigners, and the word foreign is used very loosely here, had to pay a miner's tax during this period, basically eliminating the Peruvians and the Chileans from striking it rich or mining at this time. And another kind of great example that we see in regards to mining and our own state of Arizona is a small town called Clifton, Morenci. And again, we see the role of government playing an important role. What happens, there's a great book called The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction. It's by Linda Gordon. It's a great history book if you like history. And in this book, she talks about something that happens here in Arizona. So Clifton, Morenci is at the border between Arizona and New Mexico. It's a mining town back in the 1800s, like 1880s. And there's Mexicans and Euro-Americans working in the mines. Well, in New York, you have all these orphan Irish kids that nobody wanted because they were Irish. The Irish were hated during this time. They were considered as a lower class of people, and nobody wanted to adopt these poor Irish kids who are Catholic in New York. So the orphanages that had them said, let's take them to different places. And one of the places was Clifton, where they had all these Mexican families who were Catholic also, right? Irish are Catholic, Mexicans are Catholic. So they said, why don't we kind of allow Mexicans to adopt these kids? So they bring them over to this town and to get so they can adopt these kids. And all of a sudden, all these white families are just up in arms, saying, "No, you can't give white kids to Mexicans." And it becomes a bit of a riot where white families wanted these kids. And it's interesting because, in New York, nobody wanted these kids. They were not considered white, at least not white enough for them. But as you move west, we see this process of becoming white. And it just kind of goes to show how race is such a fluid idea, that these poor Irish kids that nobody wanted at one time in New York all of a sudden become white once they arrive to the West Coast. So it's a great book if you love reading. Again, it's a great story. It's not a story, it's a great history. And the same thing happens, again, it's kind of whitewashing, right, of people's history. So you had a reading that looks at the whole fiesta event in California, and understand that these are all invented events, right? It's not like they're traditional in any sense of the word. It's just something that's created for profit. And the reading talks about this association, right? That says basically we need people to come over here to California in the 1880s and 90s to build up the economy. So what can we do? Let's come up with, a Disneyland, if you will, right, in the West Coast. The Rose Parade does the same thing. The Rose Parade's like a middle finger to New York, saying, "Look how great life is over here in the middle of winter, while you're freezing over there in New York." So it's been around for 100 years, and that's basically what it is to some extent. So Fiesta kind of works the same way, right? And it talks about the parade of how it creates this illusion of almost Darwinistic ideals of, kind of barbaric people evolving into the Euro-Americans who come west and civilize this territory, right? We put civilization in quotes here. So it creates this illusion that it's Americans who come and civilize this frontier, right? And they create this concept called the Spanish fantasy heritage, where they reinvent the history of the people that were here. As I mentioned earlier, Pio Pico and people like him, the Dons, were actually very very much so mestizos, right? They were different shades of color, if you will. And during this fiesta event, they kind of recreate the West in the image that they want to present. So if you ever go to places like Santa Barbara, now it's all very kind of Spanish and colonial style. But if you look at early pictures of Santa Barbara, it was a lot like Tombstone, that kind of old West, a lot of wood. But they created into this kind of Mediterranean, this kind of Riviera, almost looking like Italy or even Spain, right? And they did this purposely. So they create this what's called romantic commercialization of the West, where, and here's like a academic definition of it, right? Where they reinterpret the history of the people from California through this lens that is very white, right? It's ahistorical, which means it's not real, but there's elements in there that seem real, that people begin to believe it. So the history of the actual people gets lost through this narrative of the Spanish fantasy heritage. So it represents the people that were here in California before the Euro-Americans came in as not as Mexicans or mestizos, but rather as Spanish, right? So it's kind of shedding that history that they don't want to acknowledge. It represents them as wealthy too. That kind of ranch aristocracy. Remember, they only represent about 10% of the population at any given time. So the majority of people were laborers. And a good example of that, if you like literature, there's a book called Ramona that was written by Helen Hunt Jackson in 1884, who essentially does this. There's a story, it's like a love story between mestizos. The real story is actually between mestizos, but she makes them into white characters. This story kind of shapes the perception of the West, particularly California, for people from, say, New York, in this very romanticized way. Again, it's a very kind of Disney version of the West. So by doing this, though, they create this notion that everything that they've done up to this point, right, from 1848 to 1890, when this parade takes place, right, this event takes place, was good, because it developed into this kind of Euro-American ideals of civilization, again, neglecting the history that was here. And this is why you have classes like Chicano Studies to say, no, they were not Spanish, they were mestizos, right? And it's, the things that we've been learning up to this point. So what happens to the actual people that were here? Well, the people that were here, they present them in this, the Americans present them in a particular way, but the reality of their experience is quite different. What we find is that these, because the people are still alive, right? I mean, Pico survives 1848 and he kind of still lingers and he loses everything, but we find that they're not just victims of this conquest, right? Yes, they didn't cross the border, the border crossed them, but they're also not sitting there just, well, we can't do anything, let's just give up. No, they actually fight back in different ways. So some of them actually took legal action. As I said, some of them submitted their um, their their documents in order to keep their land. Unfortunately, a lot of times they lost it in different ways. One way was that I think I mentioned earlier that lawyers, right, took up a good chunk. Even when squatters squatted on their territory, the problem here is that they had to take each squatter to court. And remember, they own thousands of acres, and that could get really expensive. So what was happening is that squatters would actually squat in the Don's territory, and then the Dons used to have cattle, and the cattle used to roam around because it's just kind of free land, and it's their land. And they would actually go into the squatters' territory where they were growing food to eat it, and the squatters would actually kill the cattle, which ultimately hurt the Don because it hurt their livelihood, right? That they would sell the cattle for money and so forth. And unfortunately, they had no legal rights because everything was up in the air at that moment because they're trying to prove that the land was theirs. So they had to take each person to court, each squatter to court, and you can have hundreds of squatters squatting in your territory, and if you didn't lose it to the squatter, you would lose it to the lawyer who was representing you. So slowly but surely, people lost their land. But they did, again, agency is not just this idea of always being successful. They took action, but sometimes they lost. But at the very least, they did something about it, right? That's what agency represents. And a good example of that is this book called By the Squatter and the Don, written by this woman, I can't remember her name, something Louise de Burton. And she was alive. Her father was a Don. This is written back in the 1890s, I believe. And she writes a novel. It's like a love story, a romance novel, but it's also very biographical because it talks about her family's experience going through this shift that happened in this period. And in one of the stories, she talks about what I just told you about how they lost, some of their land to the squatters and all that, listening to lawyers and all that stuff. And what happens, as you can kind of see from her name, Ruiz de Burton, which means her last name is Ruiz, right? Part of the Ruiz family who own land in things like San Diego. But she marries somebody, right? De Burton, which means, that's not a Mexican name, right? So she marries an American. So a lot of times these Dons, they would marry off their daughters to well-connected people, particularly connected to the government. And that way they are able to keep at least some of their land because they wouldn't, these people were able to negotiate in ways to keep some of this territory. And that was one way, which is odd because, again, when we pass territory on to the next generation, it's always through the male line. And this is a great example of how women became beneficial, and they use them basically so they can keep the Dons, so the Dons can keep their land. Other ways that they fought back was through social banditry, and by social banditry, it's a way, again, that frustration builds up where minorities are actually put in barrios. They become strangers in their own land, right? They used to own this territory. It used to be their country, and now they're viewed as the strangers. So many people kind of fight back in kind of little ways. Sometimes they kill people. And we find that San Quentin, the majority of the inmates tend to be Spanish speaking, which means, they were part of the old groups. And a lot of times they were fighting back, and, the laws were against them. They faced racism. So they were put in prison. They were put in jail for, petty crimes and things like that. I know there's a story about a woman who was a Latina woman. I think her name was Juanita. And she was about to get raped by Anglo-Americans. So she killed them. And they hung her, right? The jury, which was made up of friends of the person she killed, said she was guilty, and so she had no chance. It's just the reality in the world that they're living at this time, right? This new conquered generation. So we have people who fought back. People like Joaquin Murrieta being the most famous. Joaquin Murrieta, he worked in the mines. I think. Some Americans came in and raped his wife and killed her along with his kid. And Joaquin Murrieta, obviously angry, sought revenge, and he went up and down the state of California seeking the people who committed this crime and killed them. But now that he was doing these things, now he became the criminal, right? And there's a whole posse set up to capture him. And I know about him. I mean, he's a very famous character because a lot of people say the character of Zorro is based around his life. But where I grew up in Paso Robles, there's a small town called Creston City, I believe. And supposedly Joaquin Murrieta stayed there for a good period of time during this whole situation. And we find that, again, these are all forms of agency, and we find that people actually took political action to address this. Carlos Velasco, who wrote a newspaper called El Fronterizo, addressed some of the problems that these people were facing. Their experiences in this new world that they were living in. They addressed the rights that were no longer acknowledged, even though they were protected by the U.S. Constitution. Remember, Mexican Americans come into the United States as U.S. citizens, right? So this newspaper and this activist did a lot to protect the Mexican American from these kind of racist Americans. I think it was in New Mexico. I'm gonna have to go back and look. And one other organization that's very kind of significant is Las Coras Blancas. Kind of almost sounds like the KKK. It's not, but it kind of sounds that way. And I just want to quickly kind of read you some of their platform. It was like a secret organization that went around, kind of like the social banditry. But it's a secret organization that eventually becomes an organization that has a platform to address the rights, particularly of people that were losing their land. So they actually had a platform called Nuestra Plataforma, and basically it's a list of grievances that they have against the U.S. government. And one of them is, we want the Las Vegas grant settled to the benefit of all concerned, and this we hold is the entire community within the grant. So basically advocating for grant rights, right? Another one is, our purpose is to protect the rights and interests of the people in general, and especially those of the helpless classes, addressing again the rights of this new conquered generation. And it kind of continues. I won't read you every single one, but they're kind of interesting. It says, we are down on race issues and will watch race agitators. So those people that are being racist, basically. And they want their voices heard. We must have a free ballot and fair court, and the will of the majority shall be respected. Again, advocating for their rights as citizens to vote. It is noted that they had a strong following, and here's a picture of them. You see them kind of hiding their faces. One thing that they would go around is, they would cut down fences that were owned by Anglo-Americans. They do all these little things just to kind of piss them off, basically. But again, it shows their agency against Anglo-racist and agitators. So yeah, they're speaking for the Spanish. They're the voice of the Spanish-speaking people, addressing their land rights. So what do we learn? Number one, we find that yes, the West was a place of opportunity, but even Anglo-Americans end up being hurt, right? Particularly poor ones. After the war, a lot of people were promised land in the American side, and unfortunately, they could not keep it. They could not afford to keep it. They needed money, so they end up selling a lot of their land to speculators, particularly in places like Texas. So even poor Anglo-Americans lost during this U.S.-Mexico war. So when we think of the West as a land of opportunity, yes, it is, but mostly for the upper classes, or at least those who have kind of close government connections, as I showed with the railroad companies and so forth. And this concept as to who built the West, as I try to prove to you, and again, there's so much more. There's a book that just focuses on how the West was developed by government. And, it wasn't this rugged individual, the concept of hard work equals success. It was government, right? It was welfare government, if you will, who built the West. And then another thing that we see in this presentation, how the West is being reconstructed for economic development, right? Cities, if you go up and down the coast of California, they get redesigned in a very kind of Western, sorry, not Western, but very kind of Spanish style architecture in order to develop, commercial interests in these places. I guess, you see that in Phoenix too. I mean, every house here looks like we're in Spain, right? With that tile roof, terracotta tile roof and white paint or so forth, right? So we kind of do that here too. However, and so all these bad things are happening to Mexicans. However, I did want to show you that they are fighting back with whether it's Joaquin Murrieta or using the legal system, right, to keep their land, or even other forms of resistance through Las Coras Blancas. So we do see that they're not just victims of this. So, but obviously they do feel it, but they do fight back in different ways. So we see that activism predate the 1960s, right? Everybody thinks Cesar Chavez, Cesar Chavez, Cesar Chavez. Well, there's other people fighting against racism way before Cesar Chavez. All right, we'll stop it there.